Right now, tonight, across some of Iran's largest cities, millions of people are sitting in the dark. Not for an hour, not during a scheduled maintenance window. In rolling, unpredictable blackouts that hit entire neighborhoods without warning, in the middle of one of the hottest summers this region has ever recorded. And the official explanation Iranian state media keeps repeating, that this is simply heat and demand, is starting to fall apart the moment you look closely at who's actually being left without power and who isn't. Tonight, we're going to show you what's really behind the blackouts sweeping across Iran, why even the regime's own state-aligned media can't keep the story straight, and why the timing of this collapse might be the most revealing detail of all. You would expect a country at war to prioritize keeping the lights on in its capital. Instead, residents of Tehran are reporting power cuts that arrive without any warning at all, sometimes multiple times a day, while the state electricity company issues public denials of blackout schedules that are already circulating widely online. That contradiction alone should stop you in your tracks. A government publicly insisting there is no organized rationing plan, while millions of citizens are living through exactly that every single day. Before we go further, you need to understand the scale of what's actually happening, because power outage doesn't begin to capture it. Iran's grid management company has openly described the period from early July through early August as the most critical month the country's electricity sector has faced. Industrial electricity allocations have been slashed dramatically, in some cases cut from 8 megawatts down to just 2, forcing factories to operate at roughly 10% of their normal capacity, a level Iran's own cement association has publicly called economically unviable. Cement factories alone have had their power allocations reduced by 90% during the worst weeks of this crisis. This isn't a temporary inconvenience. This is industrial Iran being quietly, deliberately starved of electricity while the government insists everything is under control. Let's break down the actual mechanics of what happens when a power grid gets rationed like this, because the technical reality behind the term blackout matters more than the word itself suggests. Electrical grids aren't simple on-off systems. They're delicately balanced networks where supply and demand have to match almost perfectly in real time, or the entire system risks cascading failure. When a grid operator can't generate enough power to meet demand, the standard response is deliberate rolling load shedding, cutting power to specific areas in rotation to protect the system as a whole from a total collapse. That's a defensible emergency measure on paper, but it only stays defensible if it's applied transparently and predictably with real advance warning, so hospitals, water treatment plants, and vulnerable households can plan around it. What Iranian citizens are describing instead, outages with zero warning, official denials of the very schedules residents can see circulating online, and inconsistent explanations, depending on which city is asking, isn't rolling load shedding as an emergency safety measure. It's something closer to opaque, discretionary rationing, dressed up in the language of routine grid management. Now, let's look specifically at how this crisis is playing out inside Tehran itself, because the capital's experience diverges sharply from what state media wants the country to believe. The Tehran Electricity Company has taken the unusual step of publicly denying that any organized blackout schedule exists, even as residents across the city report power cuts arriving predictably enough that informal crowdsourced schedules have begun circulating on social media and messaging apps. That contradiction, a state utility insisting there's no plan while millions of residents are living through what looks exactly like one, has become one of the most quietly explosive details of this entire crisis. It suggests either that the government genuinely doesn't have visibility into its own rationing decisions, which would be its own kind of alarming admission, or that it does have that visibility and has decided transparency about who gets prioritized and who doesn't is more politically dangerous than the blackouts themselves. Let's talk about who the regime says is to blame, because the official explanation keeps shifting depending on who's speaking and when. Iran's energy minister, addressing the crisis directly, described the country as being in what he called an exceptional situation, and pointed to two specific culprits: unauthorized electricity consumption and cryptocurrency miners illegally drawing power off the grid. He went on to say that areas affected by the war are being prioritized for electricity supply, while acknowledging, almost as an aside, that some cities are simply not part of that priority list. Read that statement again. A senior Iranian official just publicly confirmed that the government is making conscious, deliberate choices about which cities get electricity and which don't, based on a scale of wartime priority the public was never given a vote on. But here's where the official story starts to crack. State-aligned outlets, including Far's news agency, an organization closely tied to Iran's conservative establishment, have been forced to report on outages hitting cities well beyond Tehran, in some cases with zero advance warning to residents. When officials are asked to explain these specific incidents, the language shifts from cryptocurrency miners to something vaguer: technical malfunctions or planned load management measures, never quite settling on one consistent explanation. And that inconsistency matters, because if this crisis truly were just heat and illegal crypto mining, the explanation wouldn't need to keep changing every time a new city reports going dark. Now let's look at what's actually been happening to Iran's electrical infrastructure over the past several months, because the timeline here is impossible to ignore. This crisis isn't unfolding in isolation. It's unfolding in the direct aftermath of a war that specifically targeted Iranian infrastructure, including power generation and transmission facilities connected to military and nuclear sites. Regime officials themselves have acknowledged that damage inflicted during recent military strikes is a contributing factor to the outages, even while publicly emphasizing heat and demand as the primary causes. When a government's own officials admit that wartime strike damage is part of the reason millions of citizens are sitting without power. That's not a footnote. That's the headline the state is trying very hard not to lead with. Let's follow the money, because that's often where the real story hides. While ordinary Iranians endure blackouts with zero warning, electricity is simultaneously being sold on Iran's own energy exchange, at prices roughly 4 times the standard rate. Think about what that actually means. In the middle of a supposed shortage so severe that hospitals, homes, and factories are being cut off, someone, somewhere, is still able to buy electricity, just at a dramatically inflated price. A genuine total scarcity doesn't usually come with a functioning premium marketplace sitting right next to it. Scarcity paired with a thriving four-times-markup trading exchange looks a lot less like an accident of nature, and a lot more like a system where access to power has become a commodity controlled, prioritized, and monetized by whoever sits closest to the decision-making. And the blackouts aren't happening in isolation from Iran's other infrastructure collapse either. In numerous regions, when the electricity goes out, it takes the water pumping stations down with it, meaning entire neighborhoods lose both power and running water in the same moment. This isn't two separate crises happening to coincide. It's one collapsing system, because Iran's water and electricity infrastructure are deeply interconnected, and the same institutional failures, compounding for years, underinvestment, poor maintenance, and now the direct damage from war, are hitting both systems at exactly the same time. Air conditioning fails during extreme heat. Refrigerated food spoils. Businesses shut their doors mid-shift. For millions of ordinary Iranians, something as basic as reliable electricity has become a gamble they lose more often than they win. This is also not a new crisis quietly building in the background. It's the latest, most severe chapter of a much longer breakdown. Back in the summer of 2025, Iran experienced a sharp water crisis that triggered protests across the country, with residents in some regions going without water for up to 3 consecutive days at a time, compounded by an extreme heat wave that pushed the system past its breaking point. Demonstrators chanted a slogan that has only grown more relevant since water, electricity, life, our basic right. That protest movement never fully disappeared. It simply went quiet for a while. The exact same pattern we keep seeing across every part of this crisis, before resurfacing again this year, worse than before. Let's talk about the timing, because it might be the single most politically explosive detail in this entire story. This latest, most visible wave of blackouts intensified almost immediately after the conclusion of a week-long funeral ceremony for Iran's supreme leader following his assassination earlier this year. Only days after that funeral ended, millions of Iranians found themselves confronting the exact same familiar crisis all over again. Unannounced outages, voltage fluctuations, and partial grid failures spreading across the country. For a regime that just spent a week projecting unity, mourning, and continuity of leadership on national television, having its own electrical grid collapse into visible chaos within days is not the kind of coincidence propaganda can easily paper over. Let's tour the different corners of this crisis and see how it's landing across Iranian society, because the unevenness of who's suffering and who isn't tells its own story. Start with the healthcare sector, where hospitals depend on uninterrupted power for everything from ventilators to refrigerated medication and vaccine storage. While officials publicly insist critical facilities like hospitals remain protected from rationing, healthcare workers and patients in several cities have described unannounced fluctuations and brief outages, hitting even facilities that were supposedly on the protected list, forcing emergency generators into service far more often than any hospital administrator wants to rely on backup power. Move to agriculture, where irrigation systems dependent on electric pumps have faced their own cuts during a summer already defined by drought and extreme heat, compounding a food security concern that predates this latest crisis by years. And move to ordinary households, where families in cities without any official war-related designation describe outages that arrive at the worst possible times, during the hottest hours of the afternoon, with no predictability that would let anyone plan a single day around them. Now widen the lens even further and look at how neighboring economies are watching this unfold, because Iran's internal infrastructure collapse doesn't stay fully contained within its own borders. Iraq, whose own power grid has historically depended in part on Iranian electricity and natural gas imports under long-standing energy agreements, has reason to watch this crisis with direct self-interest, since a supplier struggling to keep its own lights on domestically is a supplier increasingly unable to guarantee cross-border deliveries it has traditionally provided. Gulf energy traders, already tracking every twist in the broader Iran conflict for its impact on regional oil and gas markets, have added grid instability to the list of variables shaping how they price risk connected to Iranian exports and regional stability more broadly. None of this makes headlines the way a missile strike does, but energy analysts increasingly treat domestic infrastructure collapse as its own kind of leading indicator for regional instability, often a more reliable one than public statements from any single government involved. If this pattern feels familiar, it's because infrastructure collapse under wartime and sanctions pressure has played out before, with lessons that apply directly here. Syria's electrical grid, battered by years of civil war and international sanctions, spent the past decade cycling through exactly this kind of crisis: official denials, shifting blame between war damage and mismanagement, and a black market for electricity access that thrived even as ordinary citizens went without. Venezuela's repeated nationwide blackouts throughout the past decade followed a similar arc, chronic underinvestment colliding with acute crisis, officials blaming everything from foreign sabotage to technical failures, while ordinary households absorbed the consequences in the dark. The pattern experts keep flagging across every one of these cases is the same one now playing out in Iran. A grid that fails gradually for years rarely gets fixed by the government that let it fail in the first place. It usually just keeps failing more visibly, until the political cost of ignoring it finally outweighs the cost of confronting it. Because the scale here goes far beyond isolated news stories. Industrial electricity allocations cut by up to 75% in some sectors. Cement production capacity reduced by 90% during the worst stretch of the crisis. Electricity trading on the open exchange at 4 times the standard rate. An entire month from early July through early August that Iran's own grid management officials describe as the most critical the sector has ever faced. And running underneath all of it, a separate but connected crisis. Iran spent nearly 5 months earlier this year under a nationwide internet blackout, one that Iran's own communications minister admitted was costing the economy over $35 million a day, with independent economists estimating the true impact, once indirect costs were included, ran considerably higher than that. Two critical modern infrastructure systems, internet and electricity, both collapsing under strain within months of each other in the same country during the same war. Let's widen the lens and look at how different parts of Iranian society are experiencing this exact same crisis in very different ways, because that gap tells its own story. Ordinary residents in cities beyond Tehran describe outages hitting with no advance warning whatsoever, leaving families scrambling in real time rather than planning around a published schedule. Industrial manufacturers, already struggling with liquidity shortages and limited access to raw materials thanks to sanctions and the broader economic strain of the war, now describe the electricity shortage as delivering what one industry official called the final blow to an already fragile sector. Meanwhile, Iran's Chamber of Commerce has acknowledged that despite government promises to shield industry from cuts, specifically during the peak summer months of August and September, power interruptions remain, in their own words, unavoidable. When the body representing Iran's own business community is publicly contradicting government reassurances, you're no longer looking at a messaging problem. You're looking at a government that has lost control of its own narrative. There's also a political dimension to this crisis worth examining closely, because Iran's leadership transition adds a layer of instability that pure infrastructure numbers can't capture on their own. With power reportedly consolidating around a smaller circle of military and clerical figures following the assassination of the supreme leader earlier this year, decisions about something as consequential as which cities get electricity and which don't are increasingly being made by a leadership structure, still finding its footing, still working out its own internal hierarchies, at exactly the moment the country's basic infrastructure is under maximum strain. Analysts studying Iran's internal politics have noted that new, less consolidated leaderships often struggle more than established ones to manage exactly this kind of slow-burning domestic crisis, because the political cost of visible failure lands on leaders who haven't yet built up the accumulated public trust or authority to absorb it easily. It's worth pausing to explain why cryptocurrency mining, the culprit officials keep returning to, has become such a persistent drain on Iran's grid in the first place, because the explanation reveals something about the broader economic pressures shaping this entire crisis. Iran's currency has faced severe devaluation throughout this war, and cryptocurrency has become one of the few ways ordinary Iranians and sanctioned businesses alike can move value in and out of an economy increasingly cut off from the normal international financial system. Electricity in Iran has historically been heavily subsidized, making it, until recently, remarkably cheap by global standards. which turned the country into an attractive, if unauthorized, location for energy-intensive crypto mining operations, looking to avoid the far higher electricity costs found elsewhere in the world. In other words, the very sanctions, pressure, and economic isolation driving Iranians toward cryptocurrency in the first place is now circling back to worsen the electricity crisis those same sanctions helped create, a feedback loop that's easy to miss unless you trace the entire chain back to its source. Let's also talk about what happens to public trust in a government during a crisis like this one, because that's ultimately the variable that matters most for anyone trying to forecast where this goes next. Iranians have now lived through, within roughly the same 18-month window, a nationwide internet blackout lasting nearly 5 months, a summer water crisis severe enough to trigger nationwide protests, a war that saw the assassination of the country's supreme leader, and now a second consecutive summer of severe, unpredictable electricity rationing. Each of these crises, taken individually, might be survivable for a government with a reserve of public patience to draw on. Stacked one on top of another in rapid succession over less than 2 years, they represent something closer to a cumulative erosion of the basic promise every government makes to its citizens, that in exchange for obedience and taxation, the state will at minimum keep essential services running. When that promise breaks repeatedly in full public view, the political consequences rarely stay contained to the specific crisis that triggered them. To understand how quickly this specific crisis escalated, it helps to walk through the timeline in order. Iran's grid management company first began publicly flagging early warning signs of strain back in the late spring, as summer heat began building ahead of schedule. By mid-May, reporting from Iranian outlets revealed the first dramatic cuts to industrial electricity allocations, with some sectors seeing their power supplies slashed by 75% almost overnight. Through June and into July, as the broader war with Israel and the United States continued grinding on, official statements increasingly began acknowledging strike-related damage as a contributing factor alongside heat and demand. By the final weeks of July, cement production specifically had been cut by 90%. And Iran's own Chamber of Commerce was publicly acknowledging that promised protections for industry throughout August and September were, in their words, unlikely to be fully honored. And then, in the immediate aftermath of the Supreme Leader's funeral, the crisis reached what officials themselves have called its most critical stretch yet: unannounced outages spreading well beyond Tehran into cities with no direct connection to the war's military priorities at all. 6 weeks, from mid-May to early August, took Iran's electricity crisis from a manageable, seasonal strain to a full-blown national emergency that even pro-government media outlets can no longer fully paper over. Now, it would be irresponsible not to give you the other side of this, because the outages aren't purely a story of deliberate government failure with nothing else at play. Iran genuinely has experienced one of its most extreme heat waves in recent memory this summer, and extreme heat drives electricity demand up sharply everywhere in the world, not just in Iran, as air conditioning units run harder and longer across an entire population. Iran's energy minister isn't entirely wrong that unauthorized cryptocurrency mining operations, which draw enormous amounts of power illegally off the grid, have genuinely worsened strain on a system that was already fragile before this crisis began. And Iran's electricity infrastructure has faced chronic, well-documented underinvestment for years, long before this war started, meaning some of what's happening now would likely be occurring in some form, even without the added pressure of recent military strikes. Under this reading, the blackouts are a convergence of bad luck, poor planning, and genuine external strain, not necessarily a story of the state deliberately choosing which citizens deserve power and which don't. But here's where that explanation runs into trouble. If this were purely about heat and illegal crypto mining, you wouldn't need a functioning 4-times-markup electricity exchange running in parallel with genuine shortages, because a true universal scarcity doesn't leave room for a premium marketplace to keep operating smoothly beside it. If this were purely about weather and demand, the energy minister wouldn't need to specifically state, on the record, that war-affected areas are being prioritized while other cities are explicitly not, because that statement only makes sense in a system where scarcity is being actively managed and allocated, not simply an unavoidable natural consequence hitting everyone equally. A government dealing with a purely external weather-driven crisis explains itself once, consistently, and moves on. A government managing a crisis it doesn't want fully understood keeps shifting the explanation: cryptocurrency miners, then technical malfunctions, then load management, depending on which city is asking and which official is answering. There's one more angle worth exploring, and it concerns exactly who has the power, quite literally, to decide who keeps their power during a crisis like this. Iran's electricity distribution runs through a mix of state utilities and regional distribution companies, many of them opaque, even to ordinary Iranian journalists trying to track exactly how rationing decisions get made. That opacity isn't necessarily evidence of a coordinated conspiracy. It may simply reflect a bureaucracy so layered and poorly coordinated that no single office can give a consistent answer, even if it wanted to. But the effect on ordinary residents is the same either way. No one they can call, no published schedule they can trust, and no clear channel to hold any specific decision maker accountable for why their specific street went dark, while the one 2 blocks over didn't. It's also worth examining what a crisis like this does to public health outcomes over time, because the consequences of chronic, unpredictable power loss compound in ways that don't always show up immediately in the headlines. Hospitals running on backup generators for extended stretches face increased equipment failure rates and higher operational costs that eventually strain already limited healthcare budgets. Food safety becomes a rolling concern in a country where refrigeration can no longer be assumed as a constant, raising the risk of foodborne illness in exactly the population least able to absorb additional healthcare costs. Mental health researchers who study populations living under chronic infrastructure stress, from wartime Beirut to sanctioned Venezuela, have consistently found that unpredictability itself, not just the outage, is what drives the most significant psychological toll, the inability to plan even a single day with confidence, wearing down resilience far faster than a predictable, if inconvenient, fixed schedule ever would. Let's also talk about what options, if any, ordinary Iranians actually have in the face of this crisis, because understanding the lack of alternatives is part of understanding why frustration here tends to build rather than dissipate. Private generators, the obvious individual workaround, require fuel that has become increasingly expensive and difficult to source reliably under the broader economic strain of sanctions and war. Solar power, a solution gaining traction in some sanctioned economies facing similar grid instability, remains largely inaccessible to ordinary Iranian households given import restrictions and the upfront cost involved, putting it firmly out of reach for all but the wealthiest segments of society. Battery backup systems face the same import and cost barriers. In practice, most Iranian households facing an unannounced outage have exactly one option: wait and hope their neighborhood wasn't the one left off this week's unofficial list. Consider, too, how this crisis intersects with Iran's broader economic isolation, because the electricity shortage doesn't exist in a vacuum separate from the sanctions regime that has shaped Iran's economy for years. International sanctions have made it significantly harder for Iran to import the specialized turbines, transformers, and grid components needed to properly maintain and modernize aging power infrastructure. Meaning, even in a best-case scenario where the government wanted to urgently repair war-damaged facilities, the parts and expertise needed to do so quickly are themselves harder to access than they would be for almost any other country facing a similar crisis. That reality doesn't excuse the opacity around rationing decisions, but it does help explain why even a government genuinely trying to fix this crisis as fast as possible would still be working with one hand tied behind its back. It's worth remembering that behind every statistic in this story are real households making impossible choices in real time. Families running refrigerators off car batteries to keep insulin or baby formula from spoiling. Small business owners watching walk-in coolers full of inventory slowly warm past the point of safety during unannounced outages. Elderly residents without air conditioning during dangerous heat, unsure when or if the power will return that day. This is happening in a country that only months ago buried its supreme leader in a week of nationally televised mourning meant to project strength, continuity, and control. The gap between that carefully managed image and the reality of millions of ordinary Iranians sitting in the dark, wondering whether their neighborhood made this week's unofficial priority list, is about as stark a contrast as modern propaganda has ever had to try to paper over. Let's talk about what this crisis means beyond Iran's borders. Because energy and infrastructure instability inside a major regional power rarely stays fully contained. A country struggling to keep its own lights on is, by definition, a country with less spare industrial and economic capacity to sustain a prolonged military and diplomatic standoff at the same time, whether that's the ongoing situation in the Strait of Hormuz, the ongoing negotiations over its nuclear program, or the broader economic pressure campaign the West has maintained throughout this war. Analysts watching Iran's internal stability closely have noted that a regime forced to spend political capital managing domestic blackout anger has measurably less capacity left over to project confidence and resolve on the international stage, and that trade-off shows up in everything from negotiating posture to how aggressively officials are willing to escalate any given standoff. There's also a historical parallel worth sitting with here, because Iran isn't the first government to face down an infrastructure collapse in the middle of an active regional crisis. Lebanon's total nationwide power collapse in 2024, triggered by the state electricity provider running out of fuel reserves entirely, offers an uncomfortable preview of where chronic underinvestment combined with acute financial strain can eventually lead. Once a national grid crosses a certain threshold of fragility, restoring it isn't simply a matter of turning demand back down when the weather cools. It requires real investment, real maintenance, and real political will. Three things an economy already strained by sanctions, war costs, and years of underinvestment struggles to summon all at once, even once the immediate crisis passes. Before we go any further, it's worth being honest about what we don't actually know for certain here, because that honesty matters more than ever on a story this politically loaded. We don't know the precise breakdown of how much of this crisis traces back to heat and demand, how much to cryptocurrency mining, how much to war damage, and how much to years of prior mismanagement, because Iran's own officials haven't agreed on a consistent answer themselves. We don't know exactly how the government is deciding which cities make the priority list for power and which don't, only that such a list appears to exist, according to the energy minister's own words. What we do know with much more confidence is the pattern of behavior surrounding this crisis. Shifting official explanations, a functioning premium electricity market operating alongside declared shortages, and outages that intensified sharply in the immediate aftermath of a moment when the regime most needed to look stable and in control. If you want to actually track where this specific crisis heads next, there are a few concrete signals worth watching, rather than reacting to any single dramatic headline. Watch whether Iran's Chamber of Commerce continues publicly contradicting government reassurances about protecting industry, since that specific institution, breaking from the official line, has proven to be one of the more reliable early indicators of how bad conditions actually are on the ground. Watch whether the crowdsourced blackout schedules circulating among residents start to match up consistently with what actually happens, because a growing gap between the two would suggest the situation is deteriorating faster than even informal public tracking can keep pace with. And watch whether protest slogans from last year's water crisis, water, electricity, life, our basic right, begin resurfacing in public again, since that specific combination has already shown, within the past year alone, how quickly infrastructure anger in Iran can translate into organized public demonstration. So where does this actually go from here? If Iran genuinely manages to push through the worst of the summer heat, and the electricity crisis eases as temperatures fall in the autumn, this may end up remembered as a severe but ultimately survivable stress test. One more difficult chapter in a war-strained economy that eventually stabilizes. That's the outcome Iranian officials are clearly hoping the public will simply wait out. But if the underlying causes, war-damaged infrastructure, chronic underinvestment, and a system where power increasingly flows toward whoever can pay the exchange rate rather than whoever needs it most, remain unaddressed once summer ends, this crisis doesn't disappear with the weather. It simply becomes the next slow-burning driver of exactly the kind of public anger that has already put protesters in the streets over water and electricity once this decade, with a regime now managing that anger while still fresh from burying its own supreme leader. Let's go back to where we started. Millions of people sitting in the dark tonight, in a country whose own officials can't seem to agree on why. We told you the official explanation, heat and demand, was starting to fall apart the moment you looked closely at who's being left without power and who isn't. Everything we've shown you tonight, the shifting explanations, the four-times-markup exchange running alongside declared shortages, the timing lining up almost perfectly with the end of a funeral meant to project stability, points toward an uncomfortable conclusion. This isn't simply a country struggling against summer heat. This is a government managing scarcity as a tool, whether by necessity or by design, in a country already exhausted by war, protest, and loss. And history, from Lebanon's grid collapse to Iran's own water protests just last year, has shown again and again that when millions of people are left sitting in the dark long enough, the anger doesn't stay in the dark with them. One final detail worth sitting with. A year ago, the slogan on Iranian streets was simple: water, electricity, life. This summer, two of those three words have failed simultaneously, again, in a country whose leadership has changed hands in the interim, but whose promises to its own citizens have not measurably improved. Whatever happens with the war, the negotiations, or the strait in the months ahead, the millions of Iranians sitting without power tonight are living proof that some crises don't need a battlefield to make their point. Thank you for watching. If this analysis helped you understand what's really happening behind the blackouts sweeping across Iran, make sure to like this video and drop a comment so more people understand exactly what's at stake for millions of ordinary families right now. We'll be watching this crisis closely, and we'll bring you the truth the moment anything changes.